Welcome back, dear learners. Today, we are starting the life story of one of the most admired leaders in history, Nelson Mandela. This is not just a story about a man. It is a journey filled with hope, courage, and determination. Listening to his story will not only help you improve your English vocabulary, pronunciation, and listening skills, but it will also inspire you to believe in yourself and to never give up, no matter how difficult life becomes. Let us begin at the very beginning. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in a small, quiet village called Mvezo in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. Imagine a place far away from big cities, surrounded by rolling hills, rivers, and open fields. There were no cars on the streets, no electricity, and no modern houses. Life was simple, but it was full of nature, traditions, and stories. Mandela's birth name was Rolihlahla Mandela. In the Xhosa language, this name means pulling the branch of a tree, but it can also be understood as troublemaker. It is almost as if his name predicted the kind of man he would become, someone who would challenge unfairness and shake the system. He was born into the Thembu royal family, a tribe known for its long history and rich traditions. His father, Godla Henry Mpakanyawasa, was a respected chief and an advisor to the Thembu king. His mother, Nosekani Fanny, was a gentle and religious woman who taught him about kindness, humility, and faith. Even though Mandela's family was not rich, they were respected by everyone around them. As a little boy, Mandela lived in a simple round hut made of mud and straw. The roof was made from grass, and there was no furniture like we see today. He grew up playing freely in the fields, running barefoot on the warm earth, swimming in streams, and herding cattle with other boys from the village. His life was full of joy and freedom. At night, Mandela and his friends would sit by the fire and listen to the elders of the village tell stories. These stories were not only entertaining, but also educational. They were about brave warriors, wise chiefs, and leaders who fought for their people. As young Mandela listened, he began to dream about becoming someone who could also serve and protect others. One day, his father told him something he never forgot. A real leader is not someone who wants power for himself, but someone who serves his people. These words stayed in his heart for the rest of his life. But childhood does not last forever. When Mandela was only 9 years old, tragedy struck. His father became very ill and passed away. Losing his father at such a young age was painful and confusing. But this sad moment also changed the direction of his life. His mother decided to take him to live with Chief Jongintaba, a powerful leader of the Thembu people. After moving into Chief Jongintaba's household, Mandela's life began to change in many ways. He was no longer just a boy running freely in the fields of his village. Now, he was being prepared for a bigger future. The chief treated him with love and discipline, teaching him that one day he might carry heavy responsibilities as a leader of his people. It was around this time that Mandela began his formal education. At the age of 7, he attended a local Methodist school. For a young boy from a traditional African village, this was an entirely new experience. The classrooms were simple, and the children sat on wooden benches. But for Mandela, it was the doorway to a wider world. Something unusual happened on his first day of school. His teacher, Miss Ndingane, gave him a new name, Nelson. In those days, it was common practice in South African schools for African children to be given English names by their teachers. The colonial system believed African names were too difficult to pronounce, so they replaced them with European ones. Mandela never fully understood why he needed this new name, but he accepted it. From then on, he became Nelson Mandela. Even though the name change was small, it symbolized something much larger. It showed how deeply colonial rule had entered everyday life. African traditions, languages, and identities were often pushed aside to make room for Western ideas. But Mandela did not let this stop him from learning. Instead, he focused on his studies and tried to take every lesson seriously. As a student, Mandela was curious and eager. He loved to read stories, especially about great leaders and heroes from African history. He enjoyed geography because it showed him how big the world was beyond his village. He admired English literature because it allowed him to imagine different ways of thinking and living. Most importantly, he was fascinated by history. He wanted to understand how his people had lived before colonialism and why they were now living under oppression. Mandela would later say one of his most famous quotes, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." This belief started in his childhood. He saw education not just as a way to get a job, but as a tool that could help free his people from unfair treatment. Life with Chief Jungin Taba also gave Mandela another kind of education. In the palace, he often watched important meetings. He saw how the chief listened carefully to everyone before making decisions. The elders were given a chance to speak, and their opinions mattered. Mandela learned that true leadership was not about shouting the loudest or demanding obedience, but about listening, respecting, and serving others. These lessons shaped the leader he would later become. By his teenage years, Mandela began to notice the unfairness of the world around him. South Africa was under a system called Apartheid, which separated people based on the color of their skin. White people had all the power, land, and opportunities, while black people were treated as inferior. They were not allowed to vote, live in certain areas, or even share schools and buses with white people. Mandela could clearly see the deep injustice in this system, and he began to think about how wrong it was. At the age of 16, Mandela went through an important traditional Xhosa ceremony that marked the passage from boyhood to manhood. It was a proud and exciting moment, full of singing, rituals, and community celebrations. But during this ceremony, the elders gave serious speeches. They spoke about the responsibilities of becoming a man. They also expressed their sadness about how the Tembu people and all black South Africans were living under white rule. They explained that even though young men were now recognized as adults, they had very few rights in their own country. This left a strong impression on Mandela. He felt the weight of responsibility and a growing sense of duty to his people. He understood that manhood was not only about personal freedom, but also about fighting for the freedom of others. These early experiences, his education, his new name, the lessons from the chief, and the painful truth about apartheid, all combined to shape the young Mandela. Slowly, the seeds of leadership, justice, and courage were being planted in his heart. As Mandela grew older, the lessons from his childhood and education stayed with him, but life soon brought him to a major turning point. By the time he was 19 years old, he was living under the care of Chief Jongintaba, who had treated him like a son for many years. The chief had guided him, fed him, and given him opportunities. Naturally, Mandela respected him deeply and felt he owed him loyalty. But as part of his responsibility, the chief made an important decision for Mandela's future. Following the tradition of their people, Chief Jongintaba arranged a marriage for Mandela. In those days, it was common for elders to decide whom a young man should marry, especially in royal or respected families. The chief believed he was doing the right thing, ensuring that Mandela had a wife, stability, and a place in the community. But Mandela was different from many young men of his age. He loved his traditions, but he also had new dreams. He wanted to continue his education, to explore the world, and to make his own choices about life. The thought of marrying so young, before he could chase his dreams, troubled him deeply. He felt grateful to the chief, but he also knew that this decision would lock him into a life he did not want yet. This inner conflict pushed Mandela to make one of the boldest choices of his youth. Instead of staying silent and obeying tradition, he decided to run away. It was not an easy decision. Imagine being a young man, leaving behind your family, your village, and even the chief who had raised you. But Mandela felt he had to take control of his own destiny. With a friend by his side, Mandela traveled to Johannesburg, the biggest and busiest city in South Africa. If his village was quiet and traditional, Johannesburg was the complete opposite. It was alive with energy, but also full of challenges. Tall buildings, crowded streets, and the sound of machines in factories filled the air. The city was a place of opportunities, but it was also a place where the unfairness of apartheid was much more visible. Black people in Johannesburg were treated as second-class citizens. They were forced to live in poor neighborhoods called townships, far away from the comfortable houses of white people. They worked hard, often in dangerous jobs like the gold mines, but were paid very little. Many families lived in small, crowded rooms with hardly enough food to eat. White South Africans, on the other hand, enjoyed wealth, safety, and comfort. The difference was impossible to ignore. Mandela experienced this reality personally. He rented a small room in Alexandria, one of the poorest townships in Johannesburg. It was a crowded place, filled with workers struggling to survive. He took a job as a night watchman at a gold mine, but it did not last long. Soon, through connections, he managed to get work as a clerk at a law firm. This job introduced him to something that would change his life forever: the legal system. Working in the law firm, Mandela saw how laws were used not to protect everyone equally, but to keep black South Africans oppressed. He watched black men and women come to the office with their problems, only to find that the law was against them because of the color of their skin. This angered Mandela, but it also motivated him. He began to dream of becoming a lawyer himself, someone who could fight for justice using the very laws that were meant to silence his people. But life in Johannesburg was not easy. Mandela often went hungry, sometimes skipping meals just to save money for his studies. He studied by candlelight late at night, determined to learn more and more. His hunger for knowledge was greater than his hunger for food. He believed that education was the key that could open the doors to a better future, not only for himself, but for all South Africans. During this time, Mandela also began to meet new people: activists, thinkers, and young men who were equally passionate about freedom and equality. These friendships would soon lead him into a bigger movement, one that would change his life forever. For now, Mandela was still a young man, far from home, struggling in a harsh city, but his heart was full of dreams. He had left behind tradition and security to follow a path of education, justice, and freedom. The decision to run away from an arranged marriage might have seemed small at the time, but it was the first step toward becoming the Nelson Mandela the world would one day know. By the time Mandela settled in Johannesburg, he was determined to change his future. He worked hard during the day and studied at night, never forgetting his dream of getting a good education. Eventually, his dedication paid off. He was accepted into the University of Witwatersrand, also known as Wits University, where he studied law. This was a turning point in his life. At Wits, Mandela was only one of a few black students in a university mostly filled with white students. He immediately felt the sharp reality of discrimination. Some white students refused to sit next to him or speak to him. He was often treated as if he did not belong. But instead of feeling discouraged, Mandela became even stronger. He told himself that he was not just studying for himself, but also for his people who had been denied opportunities for so long.
Law fascinated Mandela. He saw it as a weapon, a tool that could be used to fight injustice. While many laws in South Africa at the time were created to protect white privilege and control black people, Mandela believed that one day laws could also be used to create fairness and equality. He was inspired by stories of lawyers who defended the weak and gave hope to those who had none. But university life was not only about books and classrooms. It was also about new friendships and new ideas. At Wits, Mandela met students from different backgrounds: Indians, Africans, and even some white South Africans who opposed apartheid. These friendships opened his eyes. He realized that the struggle for freedom was not only for black people, but for all people who believed in justice. During this time, Mandela also became actively involved in politics. He joined the African National Congress, or ANC, a political organization that had existed since 1912. The ANC's mission was to fight for the rights of black South Africans who were suffering under apartheid. But by the 1940s, many young members, including Mandela, felt that the ANC needed a new energy. They believed that speeches and petitions were not enough. They wanted action. Together with his friends Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo, Mandela helped form the ANC Youth League. Their goal was to mobilize young people, to make them aware of their power, and to prepare them to stand up against injustice. Mandela's natural leadership skills quickly became visible. He was not afraid to speak passionately in meetings, urging others to believe in equality and to fight for it. Mandela's speeches were simple but powerful. He spoke about a South Africa where children of all races could play together, where families could live without fear, and where justice would belong to everyone. People admired his courage and his vision. One of his most famous sayings from this time was, "It always seems impossible until it's done." These words gave hope to many who felt powerless. But even as Mandela's political life was growing, his personal life was also changing. In 1944, he married Evelyn Ntoko Maze, a young nurse who shared his dream of a better South Africa. Together, they started a family, and for a while, Mandela tried to balance his life as a husband, a father, and a freedom fighter. However, this balance was never easy. Mandela's deep commitment to the struggle for justice often kept him away from home. He spent long hours in meetings, protests, and organizing activities. His marriage became strained, but Mandela felt he had no choice. He believed the fight for freedom was bigger than his own personal happiness. Meanwhile, the situation in South Africa was getting worse. In 1948, the government officially introduced new apartheid laws, making racial separation even stricter. These laws controlled where black people could live, whom they could marry, what jobs they could take, and even which schools they could attend. Black people were forbidden from voting, and they were treated as strangers in their own country. Mandela and his colleagues in the ANC knew they could not remain silent. Inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, Mandela helped organize strikes, boycotts, and peaceful protests. Thousands of black South Africans joined these movements, risking their jobs and even their lives.
But the government responded with violence. Police attacked protesters, many were arrested, and some even killed. Mandela himself was arrested several times, but he refused to be intimidated. He once said, "Courage is not the absence of fear, it is inspiring others to move beyond it." These words described his character perfectly. Even when he was afraid, he kept moving forward because he knew others were looking to him for strength. Despite the hardships, Mandela achieved one of his biggest dreams during this period. In 1952, he finally became a lawyer. Together with his friend Oliver Tambo, he opened the first black-owned law firm in South Africa called Mandela and Tambo Attorneys. The firm provided free or low-cost legal help to Black South Africans who were victims of apartheid laws. Every day, Mandela defended men and women who were treated unfairly, giving them a voice in a system that had tried to silence them. For Mandela, being a lawyer was not just a profession, it was a mission. He saw the law as a battlefield where he could fight for his people's dignity and rights. At the same time, he continued working with the ANC, preparing for an even larger struggle ahead. Mandela was no longer just a village boy who once ran barefoot in the fields. He was now a lawyer, an activist, and a rising leader in the fight against apartheid. But the road ahead was going to be full of even greater challenges, sacrifices, and dangers. By the early 1950s, Mandela had already become a well-known lawyer and activist. His law firm with Oliver Tambo gave hope to many Black South Africans who had been victims of unfair laws. At the same time, his speeches and leadership in the ANC Youth League inspired thousands of young people to join the struggle. But the South African government was watching closely, and they did not like Mandela's growing influence. In 1952, Mandela and other leaders organized the Defiance Campaign, one of the first large nonviolent protests against apartheid. Thousands of people deliberately broke unjust laws. They entered whites-only areas, refused to carry passbooks, and challenged the rules that restricted their lives. Mandela believed that peaceful resistance could wake up the world to the cruelty of apartheid. He was arrested several times during this campaign, but each time he came out stronger, more determined than before. However, the government did not remain silent. In 1956, Mandela and more than 150 other activists were arrested and charged with treason. The trial lasted for 4 long years. During this time, Mandela continued his work, defending himself in court and speaking bravely about justice. Eventually, in 1961, he and the others were acquitted, meaning they were found not guilty. But the experience taught Mandela something important. The government would never give up its power easily, and the fight would become even harder. The turning point came in 1960. On March 21st of that year, in the township of Sharpeville, thousands of Black South Africans gathered to protest against the hated pass laws, which required them to carry identification documents at all times. It was meant to be a peaceful protest, but the police opened fire on the unarmed crowd. 69 people were killed, including women and children, and hundreds were injured. The Sharpeville massacre shocked not only South Africa, but the entire world. For Mandela, it was a moment of deep pain and anger. Until then, he had believed that peaceful protest, inspired by Gandhi's teachings, was the best path. But Sharpeville convinced him that nonviolence alone might not be enough against such a brutal and violent government.
Soon after the massacre, the government banned the ANC and other political groups, forcing them to operate secretly. Mandela, along with other leaders, went underground. He disguised himself, moved from place to place, and began organizing secret meetings. During this time, he earned the nickname the Black Pimpernel because he was so good at avoiding capture. Mandela also took a new and bold step. With his comrades, he co-founded Umkhonto we, which means Spear of the Nation. This group was the armed wing of the ANC. Mandela explained that their aim was not to harm innocent people, but to sabotage government buildings, railways, and communication systems, symbols of apartheid power. The goal was to put pressure on the government without causing unnecessary loss of life. This was a very risky decision. By choosing armed resistance, Mandela knew that he was putting himself in even greater danger. He could be arrested, imprisoned, or even executed, but he believed it was necessary. He once said, "A freedom fighter learns the hard way that it is the oppressor who defines the nature of the struggle, and the oppressed is often left with no choice but to use methods that mirror those of the oppressor." During this period, Mandela traveled across South Africa in secret, organizing supporters and planning strategies. He even left the country to visit other African nations as well as England to gain support for the anti-apartheid struggle. Many leaders abroad admired his courage and promised to help. But his life became more dangerous than ever. Mandela could not see his family openly, and every day he risked arrest. He had sacrificed his personal happiness and safety for the dream of a free South Africa. In 1962, that danger caught up with him. Mandela was arrested and charged with leaving the country illegally and with inciting workers to strike. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but this was only the beginning. Soon the government would bring even more serious charges against him. Mandela's fight was entering its darkest chapter. He was no longer just a lawyer or activist. He had become the most wanted man in South Africa, a symbol of resistance, and a leader who was ready to risk everything for his people. By 1962, Nelson Mandela was already in prison, serving a 5-year sentence for leaving the country without permission and for encouraging workers to strike. But while he was behind bars, the South African police continued to investigate him and his comrades in the ANC and Umkhonto we. Soon they discovered documents that linked Mandela and others to acts of sabotage against government structures. In 1963, Mandela and several other leaders were put on trial in what became known as the Rivonia trial, named after the suburb where police had raided a secret hideout. This was not an ordinary trial. The government wanted to prove that Mandela and his colleagues were dangerous criminals who deserved the death penalty. The charges were extremely serious: sabotage, treason, and even attempting to overthrow the government. The whole world watched the trial. Some people expected Mandela to deny the charges or to beg for mercy. But he chose a very different path. Standing tall in the courtroom, Mandela used the trial as a stage to speak the truth about apartheid and about his dreams for South Africa. He admitted that he and his comrades had chosen sabotage, but he explained why. Peaceful protest had been met with bullets and massacres, like at Sharpeville.
The government had left them no choice but to resist in stronger ways. He made it clear that their fight was not against white people, but against injustice itself. Then came his most powerful words, words that would echo across the world. In his closing statement, Mandela said, "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." These words shocked the courtroom. They showed that Mandela was not afraid of death. He was ready to sacrifice his own life if it meant his people could one day be free. To many around the world, this speech turned him into a hero of justice. The judges did not sentence Mandela to death, but they did give him life imprisonment. He was sent to Robben Island, a bleak prison off the coast of Cape Town. Robben Island was known as a place of suffering, designed to break the spirit of political prisoners. Mandela's life there was extremely harsh. His cell was tiny, with nothing but a thin mat on the cold floor. There was no bed, no comfort, just four walls that kept him locked away. Prisoners were forced to do hard labor in a limestone quarry under the hot sun, breaking stones into small pieces. The dust from the quarry damaged Mandela's eyesight forever. Food was poor and unfairly distributed. Black prisoners received less than Indian or colored prisoners. Letters from his family were censored, and he was allowed only one visit and one letter every 6 months. Guards insulted and humiliated the prisoners daily, trying to crush their dignity. But Mandela refused to be broken. Instead of becoming bitter, he used his time in prison to grow wiser and stronger. He studied whenever he could, reading about history, politics, and law. He even learned Afrikaans, the language of the oppressors, so he could understand his enemies better. More importantly, Mandela became a teacher to other prisoners. He organized discussions, taught them about leadership, and encouraged them to stay hopeful. Many younger prisoners looked up to him as a father figure. Robben Island, instead of silencing Mandela, became a university of the struggle. Mandela also learned the power of patience. He knew freedom would not come quickly. Years passed, and yet he kept his spirit alive. He once said, "I am fundamentally an optimist." Part of being optimistic is keeping one's head pointed toward the sun, one's feet moving forward. Even in a tiny cell, he chose to keep moving forward in his heart and mind. Outside the prison walls, Mandela's name began to spread. The South African government wanted people to forget about him, but the opposite happened. Across the world, Mandela became a symbol of resistance. People marched with signs that said, "Free Nelson Mandela." Musicians sang songs about him, and leaders around the globe demanded his release. Inside prison, Mandela was physically locked away, but outside, he had become larger than life, the voice of millions who demanded freedom. This was the beginning of a long, painful chapter. Mandela would spend 27 years in prison. Yet even from behind bars, he would inspire a movement that the government could no longer control. Nelson Mandela's life in prison stretched on year after year. He had been sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964, and many thought he would disappear into silence. But instead, Mandela's spirit grew stronger, and his name became known around the world. On Robben Island, where he spent the first 18 years of his sentence, life was designed to crush prisoners. The work in the limestone quarry was exhausting. Prisoners had to break rocks in the hot sun, their hands bleeding and their eyes damaged by the blinding white dust. Mandela's eyesight never fully recovered from this. Prisoners slept on thin mats on the cold concrete floor, and food was both poor and unfairly given. For example, black prisoners like Mandela received smaller rations than Indian or colored prisoners. Letters from his family were censored, and he was allowed only one visit and one letter every 6 months. Guards insulted and humiliated the prisoners daily, trying to crush their dignity. But Mandela refused to be broken. Instead of becoming bitter, he used his time in prison to grow wiser and stronger. He studied whenever he could, reading about history, politics, and law. He even learned Afrikaans, the language of the oppressors, so he could understand his enemies better. Yet Mandela refused to let the prison destroy him. He treated even the guards with dignity, often surprising them with his calmness and respect. Slowly, many guards came to admire him, even though they were supposed to hate him. To the younger prisoners, Mandela became a teacher, a mentor, and a father figure. They called their secret lessons Mandela University. He taught them history, politics, leadership, and the importance of discipline and unity. Mandela also believed in small acts of resistance. Prisoners demanded fairer treatment, better food, and the right to study. Each small victory gave them hope. Mandela once said, "Prisoners cannot enter into negotiations with their jailers. Our dignity is not up for bargaining." While Mandela was locked away, the world outside was changing. The cruelty of apartheid was being exposed to the world. In South Africa, the government continued its oppression, forcing black people into townships, controlling their movements with pass laws, and crushing protests with violence. But resistance was growing stronger. In 1976, the Soweto uprising shocked the nation. Thousands of black schoolchildren marched against the law that forced them to learn in Afrikaans, the language of the oppressors. Police opened fire, killing hundreds, including young students. Pictures of children like Hector Peterson, a 13-year-old boy shot dead, spread across the world. Soweto lit a fire in the anti-apartheid struggle. The youth of South Africa now joined the fight with courage and determination. Internationally, Mandela's name became a symbol of hope. Campaigns to free Nelson Mandela spread across Africa, Europe, and America. Musicians wrote songs, students organized protests, and countries began placing sanctions on South Africa, refusing to trade or do business with the apartheid government. The world was turning against South Africa's leaders. Mandela himself could not see these global movements, but he heard about them in pieces from new prisoners, smuggled newspapers, and rare visits. Each time he learned that people across the world were chanting his name, his determination grew stronger. He realized that though he was behind bars, he was not forgotten. By the early 1980s, pressure on the South African government was increasing. Inside the country, strikes, boycotts, and demonstrations were spreading. Outside, the government faced isolation and criticism. The question was no longer if apartheid would end, but when. In 1982, Mandela was moved from Robben Island to Pollsmoor Prison in Cape Town, along with other ANC leaders. The government hoped to isolate him from the younger prisoners who looked up to him. But instead, this move gave Mandela slightly better conditions and more chances to communicate. He secretly sent out messages encouraging the ANC to stay united and disciplined. During this time, the government also began to realize that Mandela was different. Unlike some radicals, he did not call for hatred or revenge. He spoke of peace, democracy, and unity between all races. Even some white South Africans began to see him not as a terrorist, but as a possible leader for the future. In the late 1980s, while still in prison, Mandela even met secretly with government officials. He told them clearly the ANC would never stop fighting until apartheid ended. But he also promised that once freedom was won, there would be no revenge against whites, only reconciliation. By now, Mandela had spent more than 20 years in prison. His hair had turned gray, his health was weakened, but his spirit was unbroken. To millions, he was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol of justice, patience, and unshakable hope. The government could no longer silence him. The world demanded his release. And soon, that moment was coming.
By the late 1980s, South Africa was at a breaking point. The apartheid government was facing enormous pressure from both inside and outside the country. Inside South Africa, protests, strikes, and resistance grew stronger every year. The people refused to be silent. Outside, many countries had imposed economic sanctions, sports boycotts, and cultural bans on South Africa. The country was becoming isolated, and its economy was suffering. At the same time, Mandela had spent more than 25 years in prison. He had been moved from Robben Island to Pollsmoor Prison, and later to Victor Verster Prison, where the conditions were less harsh. By then, he was no longer treated as just another prisoner. The government knew that he had become the key to South Africa's future. In secret, government officials began meeting with Mandela. They hoped to find a way to end the growing unrest. Mandela was wise and careful during these talks. He made it clear that he was not willing to compromise on the basic demands. Apartheid must end, the ANC must be unbanned, and political prisoners must be released. Yet he also reassured them that when freedom came, there would be no revenge. South Africa's future, he said, must be built on peace and reconciliation,
not hatred. In 1989, a major change happened. President P.W. Botha, who had ruled with a hard hand, was replaced by F.W. de Klerk. De Klerk understood that apartheid could not survive much longer. The system was too unjust, and the world was watching. He took a bold decision that would change South Africa forever. On February 2, 1990, de Klerk announced in Parliament that the ANC and other banned organizations would be legalized. He also said that Nelson Mandela would soon be released. The news spread like wildfire across the country and around the world. Finally, on February 11, 1990, after 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela walked free. The world watched live on television as he took his first steps out of Victor Verster prison, holding the hand of his wife, Winnie Mandela. Millions of South Africans cried, cheered, and sang freedom songs. Around the globe, people celebrated as if a hero had returned home. Mandela was 71 years old. His hair was gray, his body thinner, but his spirit was as strong as ever. The first words he spoke to the people made history. He thanked them for their courage and sacrifices, and he declared that the struggle was not yet over. Apartheid had to be completely dismantled. But Mandela's release did not mean peace came overnight. South Africa entered a difficult and dangerous period. Violence broke out between different political groups. Some white extremists resisted change, while some black groups fought among themselves. The country was like a pot about to boil over. Mandela showed his greatest strength during this time, his ability to unite. Instead of calling for revenge, he called for calm. Instead of bitterness, he preached forgiveness. He met with leaders of all groups, including his former enemies, and urged dialogue. He knew that if South Africa fell into civil war, freedom would be lost. One of his remarkable qualities was his ability to forgive. He invited his former jailers to his home. He even had tea with the widow of Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect of apartheid. Mandela believed that reconciliation was the only path forward. As he often said, resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemy. Over the next few years, Mandela worked side by side with President de Klerk to negotiate the end of apartheid. They faced many challenges, violent clashes, political assassinations, and deep mistrust. But step by step, they moved forward. Mandela showed patience, wisdom, and an unshakable commitment to democracy. In 1993, Mandela and de Klerk were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to bring peace to South Africa. The world recognized that Mandela was not just a leader for his own country, but a global symbol of justice and forgiveness. Finally, in 1994, South Africa held its first truly democratic election. For the first time in history, Black South Africans were allowed to vote. Millions stood in long lines, some for hours, with tears in their eyes, ready to cast their first vote for freedom. On that historic day, Nelson Mandela, the man who had once been branded a terrorist and locked away for 27 years, was elected the first black president of South Africa. It was the beginning of a new chapter, the birth of a rainbow nation, where all races could live together in equality and hope. On May 10, 1994, history was made. Nelson Mandela stood before thousands at the Union Buildings in Pretoria and took the oath of office as the first black president of South Africa. The world watched as a nation that had been torn apart by racism and violence now placed its hopes in a man who had spent 27 years behind bars. In his inauguration speech, Mandela promised to build a rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world. His vision was clear. South Africa would not be a country of revenge, but of reconciliation. He wanted black and white South Africans to walk forward together, leaving the dark years of apartheid behind. But being president was not an easy task. Mandela inherited a deeply divided country. The scars of apartheid were everywhere: poverty, inequality, anger, and mistrust. Many black South Africans wanted justice. They had suffered for generations, and now they wanted land, jobs, and opportunities. On the other hand, many white South Africans were afraid. They feared they would lose everything, or even face violence. Mandela had to guide the country carefully, balancing hope with stability. One of his greatest achievements was creating the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Instead of holding revenge trials, the TRC invited people who had committed crimes under apartheid, including police, soldiers, and officials, to confess their actions publicly. Victims were also allowed to share their painful stories. In some cases, those who told the full truth were granted amnesty. The idea was not to forget the past, but to heal by bringing everything into the open. It was a bold and emotional process, watched by the entire nation. Mandela also focused on uniting South Africans through symbols of pride. One of the most famous moments came in 1995 during the Rugby World Cup hosted in South Africa. Rugby had long been seen as a white man's sport. But Mandela, wearing the green jersey of the national team, stepped onto the field to cheer for the Springboks. When South Africa won the championship, the image of Mandela celebrating with the mostly white team captain, Francois Pienaar, sent a powerful message. This is one nation, united by sport and hope. Beyond reconciliation, Mandela's government worked on real change. His policies aimed at improving housing, healthcare, and education for millions of poor South Africans. His Reconstruction and Development Program, RDP, built new homes, provided clean water, and expanded electricity. For many, it was the first time they felt included in the country's progress. Yet, Mandela knew that change would take time. Apartheid had lasted for decades, and its effects could not be erased overnight. He often reminded people that freedom was only the first step. Building equality was a long journey. What made Mandela unique as a leader was his humility. Despite being president, he lived simply. He often cooked for guests, greeted staff warmly, and even wore colorful shirts instead of formal suits, which became known as Madiba shirts. He listened to people from all walks of life, and he never let power change his character. Mandela also surprised the world when he chose to serve only one term as president, stepping down in 1999. Many urged him to stay in power, but Mandela believed true leadership was about service, not control.
He wanted to set an example that democracy must be stronger than any single person.
Even after leaving office, Mandela continued to play a global role. He worked to promote peace in other countries, raised awareness about HIV, AIDS, and established charities to help children and the poor. He became a global elder, admired by leaders and ordinary people alike. Mandela's presidency was not perfect. South Africa still faced, and continues to face, many challenges, such as inequality, unemployment, and corruption. But Mandela's leadership gave the country its foundation of democracy, forgiveness, and unity. Above all, he showed the world something extraordinary, that a man who had been jailed for nearly 3 decades could emerge not with bitterness, but with compassion, not with vengeance, but with love for his people, all his people. Mandela once said, "Courage is not the absence of fear, it's inspiring others to move beyond it." As president, he lived by those words, guiding South Africa through one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history. After stepping down as president in 1999, Nelson Mandela began a new chapter in his life. He was no longer leading South Africa's government, but he became something even bigger, a global symbol of peace, forgiveness, and justice. People around the world called him Madiba, a term of respect from his Xhosa clan name, and he was admired as the moral compass of humanity. Mandela devoted his later years to causes close to his heart. One of his biggest concerns was the HIV/AIDS crisis in South Africa. During his presidency, the government had been criticized for not doing enough to fight the disease. After leaving office, Mandela spoke openly about HIV/AIDS, breaking the silence and stigma surrounding it. In 2005, his own son, Makatho, died from AIDS-related illness, and Mandela used this tragedy to encourage people to get tested and treated. His honesty gave courage to thousands of families affected by the disease. He also established the Nelson Mandela Foundation, which focused on social justice, education, and fighting poverty. Through this foundation, he supported programs to improve literacy, provide scholarships, and empower young leaders. Mandela believed strongly that the future of South Africa and the world depended on the next generation. He often said, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." Even in his retirement, Mandela continued to bring people together. In 2007, he helped create a group of respected global leaders called the Elders. This group worked to solve conflicts, promote human rights, and guide world leaders toward peace. Mandela himself slowly stepped back due to his age, but his influence remained powerful. As he grew older, Mandela spent more time with his family, enjoying the simple pleasures he had been denied during his long imprisonment. He loved his grandchildren, gardening, and sitting quietly in his home village of Kunu, where he had once played cattle as a young boy. Despite his fame, Mandela never lost his humility. Visitors often found him laughing, telling stories, or wearing his colorful Madiba shirts. The world celebrated Mandela many times during these years. In 2009, the United Nations declared July 18th, his birthday, as Nelson Mandela International Day, encouraging people everywhere to spend 67 minutes, one for each year of his public service, doing something good for others. This tradition continues today, reminding the world of his lifelong dedication to justice and kindness. But Mandela's health slowly declined.
In his later years, he was hospitalized several times with lung infections, a result of the harsh conditions he had suffered while working in the limestone quarries on Robben Island. The nation grew anxious each time he was admitted, knowing their beloved leader was reaching the end of his life. On December 5, 2013, Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95. South Africa and the world went into mourning. Thousands gathered outside his home, singing songs of freedom and lighting candles. Leaders from every corner of the globe traveled to Johannesburg for his memorial, one of the largest gatherings of world leaders in history. People of all races, religions, and backgrounds united to honor him. Mandela once said, "I have walked that long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter. I have made missteps along the way. But I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. I have taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I have come. But I can only rest for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not ended." His long walk to freedom became an example for the entire world, showing that even the deepest injustice can be overcome with courage, patience, and forgiveness.